What if everything you knew about Naruto was wrong? What if the loud, prank-loving dead last of the academy was never truly untalented, but simply waiting for the right opportunity to awaken? On the night Naruto Uzumaki stole the forbidden scroll, something unexpected happened. Instead of learning a single jutsu and returning it, he read everything. Every forbidden technique, every hidden secret, every piece of knowledge that Konoha had locked away for generations. And for the first time in his life, Naruto discovered a truth that would change everything. The blood of the legendary Uzumaki clan flowed through his veins. The art of sealing wasn't foreign to him. It was his birthright. While the village still saw a foolish troublemaker, a new Naruto was quietly being born. A Naruto who studied in silence. A Naruto who planned instead of rushed. A Naruto who possessed knowledge far beyond any genin, and hidden deep within the forbidden scroll waited clues about the Nine Tails, his mysterious parents, and a destiny greater than becoming Hokage. Now, as Team 7 begins its journey, Naruto must decide, will he reveal his growing power to the world, or continue hiding in the shadows until the time is right? This is the story of What If Naruto secretly mastered the forbidden scroll and became a genius before Team 7. Watch until the end, because Naruto's rise is about to change the entire ninja world forever. The village of Konoha never truly slept. Even in the deepest hours of the night, when the moon hung fat and silver above the treetops and the streets fell into a hush that bordered on sacred, there were always lights burning somewhere. A baker rising early to stoke his ovens. A mother awake with a feverish child. Shinobi moving like shadows along the rooftops, their white masks catching the moonlight for half a heartbeat before they vanished again into the dark. The village breathed even in its sleep, a slow, steady rhythm of watchfulness that had kept it alive through wars and disasters and the kind of grief that carved itself into stone. But tonight, one particular light burned where no light should have been. In a small clearing at the edge of the training grounds, far enough from the main paths that no casual wanderer would stumble upon it. Close enough to the village walls that the distant torches of the gate guards cast faint orange smears against the tree-line. A single paper lantern sat propped against the log, its flame guttering in the occasional breeze. Around it, spread in a rough semicircle, sat 17 identical figures. Every single one of them was Naruto Uzumaki. Or rather, 17 shadow clones of Naruto Uzumaki sat around the lantern, each one bent over a section of an enormous scroll that had been carefully unrolled across the grass. The original Naruto knelt at the center of the formation, both hands pressed flat against the scroll's surface, his blue eyes moving rapidly across lines of dense, complex script that would have taken a trained jonin weeks to fully decipher. Naruto had been here for 3 hours. He had, in that time, not made a single sound louder than a whisper. This alone, the silence, was perhaps the most remarkable thing about the entire scene. Anyone who knew Naruto Uzumaki knew that silence and the boy existed in a state of perpetual war with each other. He shouted when he was happy. He bellowed when he was angry. He complained loudly when he was bored, announced his intentions to the sky at full volume, and had once, famously, gotten into a screaming argument with a wall in the academy because he had walked into it, and felt it deserved to be held accountable. Silence was something that happened to other people, and yet here he was, kneeling in the grass, the enormous forbidden scroll of sealing unfurled before him like a road map to another world entirely, and he was quiet. It had started, as most things in Naruto's life started, with someone lying to him. The memory of Mizuki's face was still sharp and ugly in his mind, that particular kind of smile that Naruto had spent his whole life learning to recognize. The smile that said I am using you while the mouth was busy saying something else entirely. Mizuki-sensei had worn it so well, had wrapped the lie in such a perfectly constructed shell of helpfulness and opportunity, that Naruto had nearly walked straight into it without question. Nearly, because there had been a moment, just one, brief and easy to miss, when something in Naruto's chest had gone very still. It happened right as Mizuki was explaining the plan, leaning close with his voice dropped low and conspiratorial, his pale eyes just a fraction too bright. The plan had been simple: steal the forbidden scroll from the Hokage's personal vault, learn one technique from it before dawn, and present this knowledge to a special examiner as proof of exceptional initiative. A backdoor graduation, Mizuki had called it. A special arrangement for students with unique potential. The stillness in Naruto's chest had lasted only a second. Then his brain had caught up with his instincts, and every alarm bell he'd ever developed in 12 years of being the village's least wanted resident had begun ringing simultaneously. Teachers didn't offer special arrangements. Not to him. Not ever. But Naruto had looked at Mizuki's face, at the expectation there, the casual certainty that the dead last academy student would jump at any scrap of opportunity thrown his way. And he had made a decision. He had let Mizuki believe the lie was working. He had smiled his most convincing idiot smile, the one that reached his eyes, and his loudly voiced gratitude and his exaggerated nodding, while somewhere behind that smile, the part of him that had spent 12 years watching the village from the outside had begun calculating very quietly. If the scroll is forbidden, it contains things that are dangerous. If it's dangerous, then stealing it is a real crime. If stealing it is a real crime, then there's a reason Mizuki wants me to be the one doing the stealing instead of doing it himself. He'd stolen the scroll. He'd run exactly where Mizuki had told him to go. He'd hidden exactly where Mizuki had said to hide. And then, instead of spending those hidden hours learning one technique and waiting to be collected like a package being delivered, Naruto Uzumaki had opened the forbidden scroll of sealing and read every single word he could find. The scroll was extraordinary. He'd known it would be important. You didn't lock something in the Hokage's personal vault because it contained recipes. But the scale of what was written here, the density and the depth and the sheer age of the knowledge pressed into these pages, was something Naruto hadn't been prepared for. Not remotely. The first section had been the one Mizuki had directed him toward, Shadow Clone Jutsu, Tajukage Bunshin no Jutsu, a technique noted in the margin as forbidden due to extreme chakra consumption, potentially lethal in low-capacity users. The warning had given Naruto pause for exactly 4 seconds, at which point he'd reasoned that if he was already committing a crime significant enough to get him expelled from the academy, he might as well learn the thing properly rather than half-heartedly. The hand seals had taken him 40 minutes of practice and approximately 70 failed attempts before the technique had clicked, a sudden, almost audible snap in his chakra pathways as the jutsu found its groove, and then the clearing had been full of Narutos. 16 of them staring at their hands in identical bewilderment before they all looked up at each other and started grinning the same enormous grin. It had taken another 10 minutes for the noise to die down enough for him to keep reading. The second section was where things had gotten interesting, because the second section was not labeled with a technique name. It was labeled with a classification, Kinjutsu, Fuinjutsu applications, restricted level, authorized users, Hokage only. And beneath that classification, in cramped, careful text that was clearly much older than the surrounding script, someone had written a single additional line. For the inheritor of the Uzumaki bloodline, may you understand what these seals carry. Naruto had stared at that line for a long time, then he'd kept reading. The sealing techniques in that second section were unlike anything taught in the academy. The academy's curriculum covered the most rudimentary principles of chakra control and basic ninjutsu. They barely touched on Fuinjutsu beyond explaining that it existed and was very complicated. What Naruto was looking at now made the academy's curriculum look like the picture books that first-year students read to learn the kanji for water and fire. These were the real seals. The old ones? The kind of sealing art that the Uzumaki clan of the now-destroyed Yuzushiogakure had once been famous for. The reason other villages had feared them enough to band together and destroy them, if the history scrolls were to be believed. Barrier constructions, chakra suppression matrices, soul-binding anchors, containment arrays that could theoretically hold back forces that no conventional jutsu could touch. Naruto read with his lips moving slightly, the way he always did when he was concentrating hard on text, his finger tracing each character. Around him, his shadow clones read over his shoulder, and when he moved on to a new passage, the clones held their positions over the old ones, maintaining his understanding of what came before even as he absorbed what came next. It was, he would realize much later, exactly the right way to approach a scroll that was designed to be read by someone with enormous chakra and a technique specifically engineered to multiply learning capacity, as if the scroll had been written for this approach. He didn't dwell on that thought. Not yet. There would be time for questions later. Right now there was only the text, and the text was extraordinary. By the end of the first hour, Naruto had worked through the Fuinjutsu section well enough to understand the structural logic. Not to perform the techniques, not yet, But to understand the grammar of how they were built, the way individual kanji combined with specific chakra frequencies to produce effects that went far beyond what ink and paper should have been capable of producing. It was a language, he realized. A very old, very precise language in which the medium was reality itself. The thoughts sat in his chest like a warm coal. The third section covered what the scroll labeled Elemental Release, Advanced Applications. This section was shorter than the Fuinjutsu chapter but considerably more technical, filled with diagrams of chakra flow patterns and margin notes, written in at least 3 different hands across what appeared to be several generations of additions and revisions. The techniques here were S-ranked or above, listed with casualness that suggested whoever had originally compiled this scroll had considered these things to be tools rather than weapons, just very powerful tools that happened to require extreme caution. Futon, Shinkugyoku. Vacuum sphere. A wind nature technique that compressed air chakra into dense, invisible projectiles capable of bypassing almost all forms of conventional defense. The notes in the margin read, requires wind affinity. Chakra consumption moderate high. Effective against sand, water, and earth-based defenses due to aerodynamic penetration. Naruto read the technique's description, felt something shift in his chest, not the click of the shadow clone jutsu, something more fundamental than that, like a door swinging open in a room he hadn't known was there, and thought, wind. He didn't know yet what it meant, that instinctive recognition. He filed it away. He kept reading. The fourth section was where Naruto stopped moving entirely and simply sat still for several minutes, the scroll unrolling further in his hands, his eyes processing what he was seeing with a slowness that was entirely unlike him. Shiki Fujin. Dead demon consuming seal. The notes were sparse here. Clinical in the way that very frightening things were sometimes described clinically, as if removing emotion from the description made the thing itself smaller. The technique summoned a death god. The scroll was very matter-of-fact about this. It said Shinigami without any particular drama, the way you might say hammer or rope, and used it to seal any target, including concepts as abstract as souls and chakra constructs, at the cost of the user's own life. Beneath the primary description, in handwriting that was different from everything else in this section, cleaner, more deliberate, as though the writer had chosen each character with care, was a single additional note, used once, in the defense of the village, in the year of the Ninetales attack. The user accepted the cost willingly. Do not learn this technique unless you are prepared to make the same acceptance. Naruto stared at the initial for a long time. He turned the page. By the second hour, 17 Narutos were arranged in study formation, each assigned a different section of the scroll. The originals sat at the center, cycling through their accumulated understanding as each clone absorbed its assigned material and fed back a constant stream of surface comprehension. It was an imperfect system. Real mastery would require real practice, real repetition, real time, but as a method for achieving comprehensive familiarity with a vast body of material in a single night, it was startlingly effective. The summoning jutsu section took the longest to work through. Kuchiyos no Jutsu was listed in the scroll not as a single technique but as a family of techniques, a framework for establishing contracts with summoning clans and then calling upon those contracts under battle conditions. The mechanics were intricate. Blood offering to seal the initial contract, specific hand seal sequences that varied by clan, chakra quantity calibrated precisely to the size of the summon requested. There were notes about multiple possible contract partners, toads, slugs, snakes, hawks, a number of others that were listed as currently uncontracted with spaces left blank as if the scroll's compiler had hoped someone would eventually fill them in. Naruto practiced the hand seal sequence 17 times in a row, each clone running through it simultaneously, and managed to produce a small, confused-looking frog about the size of his fist, which blinked at him twice and then dissolved in a small puff of smoke, apparently having decided that wherever it had been summoned from was preferable to here. Progress, Naruto thought. Definitely progress. The medical ninjutsu section was frustrating. Shozen Jutsu, the basic diagnostic and healing technique used by field medics, required a quality of chakra control that Naruto simply didn't have yet. Control had never been his strength. He had chakra in quantities that could flatten training grounds, but shaping it finely enough to run a delicate healing current through specific tissues and cellular structures was like trying to paint a portrait with a fire hose. He got the theory. He could feel the technique's shape in his mind. His hands, when he tried to manifest it, produced a green glow that lasted approximately 2 seconds before it blazed up like a torch, and his clone singed its eyebrows. He made a note, not a real note, he had no paper, a mental note, filed carefully, to work on control. Specifically and seriously. If he could stabilize his chakra output enough to hold a fine technique steady, the medical applications alone would be worth the effort. But that was for later. That was for the weeks ahead, the quiet hours before dawn in places where no one would think to look for him. Tonight was about understanding. Tonight was about getting the whole picture before anyone took the scroll away from him. He kept reading. The 5th section stopped him again, but differently from the way the Shiki Fujin had stopped him. That had stopped him with dread, a cold, clarifying dread that had actually felt respectful of the technique's weight. This section stopped him with a feeling he couldn't immediately name, a strange pressure behind his sternum that took him several long moments to identify. It was the feeling of something being almost familiar. The section was titled Chakra Suppression and Concealment Techniques, and it was written in the same careful, deliberate handwriting as the note in the Shiki Fujin section. The one signed H. The technique described here was elegant in the way that only deeply practical things were elegant. No unnecessary complexity, no performance. It was a method for collapsing one's visible chakra signature inward, compressing it to a fraction of its natural projection, making the user appear to any sensing technique as a shinobi with ordinary, unremarkable reserves. The scroll noted that this technique had been developed specifically for individuals with unusually large chakra capacity, who would otherwise be immediately detectable at distances that compromised tactical positioning. For individuals with unusually large chakra capacity. Naruto looked down at his hands. He had spent his entire academy career being told that his chakra control was terrible. And it was, genuinely, he didn't dispute that. But no one had ever quite phrased the underlying reason in a way that made sense to him. It wasn't that his chakra was weak or thin or unresponsive. It was that there was simply so much of it that the control techniques designed for normal shinobi barely made a dent. It was like being handed a cup and asked to carry a river. The technique in front of him didn't ask him to control the river. It asked him to find the river's surface and hold it still. That was different. That was something he thought he might actually be able to do. He spent 20 minutes with this section, longer than almost anything else he'd read tonight, walking through the mechanism in his mind with 3 clones dedicated specifically to cross-referencing it with the few jutsu applications he'd read earlier. There were connections. The suppression technique borrowed structural logic from chakra containment seals, which meant his growing intuition about sealing arts would actually support his ability to learn this. The skills built on each other. Someone had designed this scroll to be read in order. He sat with that realization for a moment, then kept going. It was deep in the 3rd hour that Naruto found the second handwriting again, the one from the Shiki Fujin note, the one signed H. But this time it wasn't a margin note. This time it was an entire section unto itself, written on pages that were slightly different from the rest of the scroll, slightly newer, as if they had been inserted into the original compilation at some later point by someone who had the authority and the access to add to a document that was supposed to be sealed away forever. The section had no title. It began mid-thought, as though the writer had sat down to write a letter and then remembered halfway through that they were writing in a scroll instead. If you have reached this section, then you have either been given the scroll deliberately, or you found it through the kind of reckless ingenuity that I recognize because I spent considerable time trying to discourage it in your father, and failing completely. Either way, you are reading this, which means you are alive and you are curious, and you have enough chakra to have powered your way through the early sections without destroying yourself. That already tells me more about you than I realized I would feel so glad to know. I cannot tell you everything here. There are things I don't know yet. You are reading this in a future I cannot see, and I don't know what that future has made you. But I can tell you the things I know now, and I can tell you that this scroll was compiled partly with you in mind. Not entirely. The scroll existed long before you did, but when I added these pages, I thought of you. Your inheritance is complicated. You carry things that were placed in you before you could consent to carrying them, and that fact is something I live with every day. And I suspect you live with the consequences of it without knowing their source. The heaviness in your chest when you are angry beyond anger. The moments when your vision swims red. The way that when you push your body past its limits, you recover faster than you should. That is not a curse, though I know it has felt like one. I need you to hear that clearly. It is not a curse. There is more to tell. More than this scroll can hold. But what I can tell you here is this: you were made for this kind of knowledge. The sealing arts are in your blood, your mother's blood, the Uzumaki blood, the red blood that built the seals that held nations together before the nations decided they were afraid of the people who could do it. You will find, if you have not already found, that these techniques recognize you. That the few Jutsu sections felt like reading something you half remembered rather than something entirely new. Trust that feeling, and when the time comes, when you face something that seems impossible, when every resource you have does not feel like enough, remember that you were not left with nothing. You were left with everything I could give you. Look for the fourth seal in the Fuinjutsu appendix. When you are ready, H. Naruto read the letter 4 times. The 4th time, his hands were not entirely steady, and he was not entirely sure why. He hadn't cried. He wasn't going to cry. Not here, not now, not when there was still work to do and the night was still his and he wasn't ready yet to pull on the thread of what this letter might mean if he followed it to its end. He just wasn't entirely steady. He turned to the Fuinjutsu appendix. The 4th seal was there, as promised. It was a complex array, a full-page diagram of interlocking kanji arranged in concentric rings, and at the center of the outermost ring was a notation that the scroll elsewhere associated with the Nine Tails, the specific character for fox spirit, contained. Naruto looked at it for a very long time. He had known, in the way that children knew things they were never directly told, that the reason the village looked at him the way it looked at him had something to do with the Nine Tails. Everyone knew that the 4th Hokage had defeated the Nine Tails 12 years ago. Everyone knew that it had attacked the village. Everyone knew that the 4th Hokage had died in the battle. What the children of Konoha mostly did not know, because their parents had decided, reasonably and with some justification, that the information was dangerous, was what had actually happened to the Nine Tails after the battle. Where it had gone. What the 4th Hokage had actually done, Naruto had not known either. He was beginning to suspect that was changing. He did not turn the page immediately. He sat with the diagram in front of him, the concentric rings of sealing characters, the fox at the center, and he breathed carefully and evenly and did the thing he'd been practicing tonight without realizing he was practicing it. He was still. Quiet. He let the knowledge settle into him without performing a reaction to it. Without the shout or the jump or the wide grin that served as his usual armor against things that were too large to hold comfortably. This was too large. He held it anyway. Then he turned the page. He was still reading when he heard the sound, a rustle in the trees above the clearing. Too deliberate to be wind, too careful to be an animal, and every clone's head came up simultaneously. The unified alertness of 17 identical minds processing the same auditory input at the same moment. Naruto closed the scroll. Not rolled it. That would have taken time he might not have. He simply folded the open section over itself and pressed it flat, then shifted so he was kneeling over it, and in the same motion he dismissed all 17 clones in a silent, simultaneous burst that dropped all of their accumulated knowledge, every technique section, every passage, every diagram, directly into his original consciousness. The sensation was like being hit in the back of the head by 17 textbooks at once. He didn't make a sound. He pressed his hands flat against his knees, breathed through the wave of information crashing through his skull, and waited. The figure that dropped from the trees was not who he'd expected. He'd expected Mizuki, the trap closing, the other shoe dropping, the sensei arriving to collect the package he'd arranged to have delivered. He'd been running secondary scenarios in the back of his mind all night. The part of him that watched from the outside cataloging exits and response options and ways to play the next few minutes depending on who showed up and what they wanted. Iruka-sensei landed in the clearing with a hand on his weapon's pouch and his expression set in the particular combination of anger, fear, and desperate relief that Naruto associated with adults who had realized something had gone badly wrong and were not yet sure how badly. His scar was livid against his pale face. His eyes found Naruto immediately, and for a moment the expression cycled through fear into something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of a teacher who was looking at a student and trying to calculate, very quickly, how much of the last 12 years had been entirely different from what he'd thought. Naruto. His voice was controlled. The control was working very hard. How long have you been here? A few hours, Naruto said, which was true. How much of that scroll have you read? A pause. A shorter pause than Iruka probably expected from someone who had been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to do. Some of it, Naruto said, which was also technically true. Iruka took 2 steps toward him, then stopped. His eyes moved to the scroll, then back to Naruto's face. Something in Naruto's expression, the steadiness, the quiet, the absence of the usual performance, seemed to be recalibrating his assessment of the situation in real time. Naruto could see it happening, the way a really good teacher's thinking was always visible in their face if you knew where to look, and Naruto had spent a long time learning to read Iruka-sensei's face because it was one of the few faces in the village that had ever looked at him with something other than wariness. Naruto, Iruka said again, more carefully now. Tell me what Mizuki said to you. So Naruto told him. He told him all of it. The approach, the offer, the special arrangement and the backdoor graduation and the unique potential that Mizuki had dangled in front of a boy who had spent 12 years being told he had none. He told it plainly, without embellishment, and he watched Iruka's expression move through anger and guilt and the particular complicated grief of someone who was realizing that a person they trusted had done something unforgivable. He used you, Iruka said. He tried to, Naruto agreed. Iruka looked at him very carefully. What do you mean? Naruto opened his mouth to answer, and then the trees exploded. Mizuki came through the canopy like a thrown stone, fast and direct and without any of the careful, controlled approach that Iruka had used. He landed 30 feet from Naruto in a shower of leaves and broken branches, both hands already reaching for the enormous shuriken strapped across his back, his face wearing an expression that was several layers past the smile he'd used earlier. The pretense was gone entirely. What was underneath it was something Naruto recognized. He'd seen it in the faces of certain older villagers when they thought he wasn't looking. A condensed and ugly contempt that had been looking for an outlet for a long time. I underestimated you, Mizuki said, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. You didn't wait like you were supposed to. You read more than you were supposed to. I read what was there, Naruto said. The scroll, Naruto. Mizuki's voice cracked upward, the contempt sharpening into something rawer. Give me the scroll and I'll make this quick. Keep it and I'll take it anyway, and you'll, Mizuki. Iruka stepped forward, putting himself between Naruto and the other Chunin, both hands raised. Stop. Think about what you're doing. Whatever Orochimaru promised you, whatever deal you made, it isn't worth this. Stand down, Mizuki laughed. The sound was not pleasant. Stand down? Iruka, you've spent 3 years telling that child he had potential, filling his head with nonsense about hard work and the will of fire, and for what? So he could steal a forbidden scroll and drag you into this with him? He pulled the great shuriken free from its straps, the metal edge catching the moonlight. He's a monster. The whole village knows it. A container. You want to die protecting a container? Naruto watched this from behind Iruka's shoulder. He was very still. Inside the stillness, at a depth he hadn't known existed before tonight, something large and old shifted its attention upward. Not toward him, exactly. He couldn't yet communicate with it directly, couldn't form words in the space where it lived, but he could feel its awareness the way you felt a fire's warmth from across a room, watchful. Waiting to see what the small human with the enormous chakra was going to decide to do, Naruto looked at Iruka's back. At the set of his shoulders, the position of his feet, the way he placed himself without hesitation between Naruto and the thrown shuriken that was clearly coming. Iruka, who had failed him once, who had called him dead last and meant it, and who was standing here now at 3 in the morning on a clear night, ready to take a hit for a student he'd failed, because that was apparently the kind of teacher Iruka-sensei actually was underneath all the failing. He's going to get hurt, Naruto thought. Unless Naruto did something. The question was what? He had 17 sections of a forbidden scroll compressed into his skull and 3 hours of frantic shadow clone study, and a grand total of 0 field experience with any technique more complex than Academy, Taijutsu. He had not tested the techniques he'd read tonight, not the real versions, not at full scale. The frog he'd summoned had been the size of his fist, and had clearly not wanted to be there. The sealing techniques were theory. The wind technique was a diagram and a feeling. He had, however, thoroughly and repeatedly practiced the technique that had started all of this. Iruka-sensei, Naruto said quietly. Get down. Iruka turned his head, startled, and Naruto was already moving his hands through the seals, the sequence so deeply drilled into his fingers by now that he didn't need to think about it at all. Just initiate and let the muscle memory carry it through. The hand seal for Shadow Clone Jutsu, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. The pop of displaced air was the loudest sound the clearing had produced all night. A single sharp crack followed immediately by the sound of 100 identical footsteps landing in the grass. Naruto had not been modest. He had chakra to burn and a point to make, and he had made exactly 100 shadow clones, which materialized in every direction simultaneously, a perfect sphere of orange-clad, wild-haired, blue-eyed Naruto surrounding the clearing from every angle and filling the space between the tree-line and the center with a crowd that should have been physically impossible. Mizuki froze. The great shuriken was still in his hand. He was looking at the clones with the expression of a man whose plan had accounted for a child and a chunin, and had not accounted for this. A container, Naruto said, and his voice came from 100 mouths at once, and despite the fact that this was objectively somewhat absurd, there was nothing funny about the sound of it. Maybe, but I'm a container with a lot of chakra. So, he paused. 100 Narutos tilted their heads at exactly the same angle. You going to throw that, or what? Mizuki threw the shuriken. What happened next was later described by Iruka, in his written report to the Hokage, as a controlled engagement utilizing advanced clone techniques. This was a generous description. What actually happened was that 43 shadow clones moved simultaneously to intercept the shuriken from different angles while the remainder surged forward from every direction at once, and Mizuki, who was an experienced chunin and a genuinely dangerous fighter, managed to dispel perhaps 20 of them before he was simply overwhelmed by the ones he hadn't seen coming, because there were too many of them. Because the boy who had created them had chakra reserves so far beyond what a 12-year-old academy student should possess that the technique that should have been his limit was instead, for him, barely an exertion. Naruto, the original, standing at the center, used one technique that was not shadow clones. He used it quickly, quietly, before anyone was looking at him rather than at the 100 copies of him that were doing the more visible work. He brought his hands through a sequence of 4 seals from the barrier section of the scroll. A simple formation, the most rudimentary entry in that entire section, and he pushed a thin thread of chakra through his feet into the earth beneath Mizuki, and the ground held in a way that wasn't about physics, a way that said you are staying here, and Mizuki stumbled on solid ground for no reason a physical analysis would have been able to identify, and in that stumble, 30 shadow clones completed their convergence, and Mizuki went down. It was over in about 40 seconds. Naruto dismissed the clones. All of them, at once, clean and silent. The clearing went from chaotic to very quiet very fast, the sudden absence of noise almost louder than the noise had been. Mizuki lay bound in the grass. The clones had used the rope from Naruto's own equipment pouch, which was not a forbidden technique by any definition, and Iruka was staring at Naruto with an expression that had moved past complicated and was now occupying territory for which Iruka-sensei clearly did not have an existing label. Naruto picked up the scroll. He held it under one arm. He looked at Iruka, and Iruka looked at him, and in the silence between them Naruto was very aware of everything that had just changed and everything that had not yet been said. Naruto, Iruka said softly. How many? He stopped. Started again. That barrier. Those hand seals. That wasn't in the Shadow Clone Jutsu section. It wasn't a question. It was Iruka doing the math. Out loud, because Iruka had always been the kind of teacher who worked through problems verbally even when the problem was standing in front of him in orange pants. Naruto looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked back up. Iruka-sensei. Yeah, I'm going to pass the graduation exam tomorrow, right? The abrupt redirect, the very Naruto quality of the question, its total obliqueness to what had just been asked, startled a short, shaking exhale out of Iruka that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. He pressed a hand over his eyes for a moment. Took a breath, looked at the bound Mizuki in the grass, then at the scroll under Naruto's arm, then at the boy himself, 12 years old, for whisker marks, dirt on his knees, and a quality of stillness in his eyes that had not been there this morning. Yeah, Iruka said. You're going to pass. Naruto nodded. Okay. I'm going to give you the scroll back. He held it out. I want you to know I was going to give it back no matter what. I wasn't going to keep it. Iruka took the scroll. His hands were not quite steady. Naruto. What you just used, the barrier formation, Iruka-sensei. Naruto's voice was gentle, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing that had happened tonight, including the 100 shadow clones. You're going to have to report all of this. I know that, and I know there'll be consequences. He paused. But can the rest wait until after the exam? Just a flicker of something younger crossed his face, something that briefly showed the 12-year-old underneath the impossible stillness. Just let me graduate first. Then we can deal with everything else. Iruka looked at him for a very long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. They walked back through the forest together, side by side on the narrow path that led toward the village lights. Mizuki was secured. Anbu would collect him within the hour. Iruka had sent a signal. The scroll was back under Iruka's arm. The night was still warm, the kind of thick summer warmth that Konoha got in late spring, and somewhere above them an owl made a sound and fell silent. Naruto walked with his hands in his pockets. He was thinking about the letter H, the handwriting that appeared in the scroll in specific places, the Shiki Fujin note, the chakra suppression technique, the inserted pages that had not been part of the scroll's original compilation, the careful deliberateness of those characters, the way they had addressed him without knowing him, the way they had said your father so naturally and then stopped, having said enough. He was thinking about the fox spirit diagram in the appendix. The concentric rings. The character for contained. He was thinking about the warmth he'd felt in his chest when he'd read the inserted pages, a warmth that was not entirely his own, a warmth that came from somewhere deeper than his ribcage, as if something else in there had recognized what was written and leaned toward it the way a plant leaned toward light. He was thinking about inheritance, about the things that were placed in him before he could consent. About the word not a curse offered by someone who clearly understood that it would be necessary to say it. He was thinking about all of this with a quality of careful, methodical attention that had not existed in him this morning. Something had happened tonight that was not just the reading of techniques. Something had reorganized, quietly and without his permission, the internal architecture of who he was and how he held himself. He felt less like a storm and more like a river. Less like noise and more like water finding its level. It was, he suspected, going to take some getting used to. Naruto, Iruka said, breaking the quiet without apology. He'd stopped walking. They were at the edge of the forest, the village lights visible through the last line of trees. His face was turned half away, looking at the lights, and his voice was careful in the way it got when he was working up to something. What Mizuki said? The container thing. What he said you were. Naruto waited. He wasn't completely wrong, Iruka said, still looking at the lights. You do carry something. Something that was put in you when you were born, because someone had to carry it, and there was no one else. He exhaled. I should have told you years ago. I should have been the one to explain it properly instead of letting you grow up with just the shape of it, just the feeling that something was different, without the words. It's okay, Naruto said. Iruka turned to look at him. It's not. I let you down there. Yeah, Naruto agreed simply. But you stood in front of me tonight. So. He shrugged one shoulder. The gesture was casual, and entirely sincere. We're okay, Iruka-sensei. Iruka made the sound again, the one that was related to a laugh, the one that had too much feeling compressed into it to be a real laugh. He reached out and put his hand on top of Naruto's head briefly, the way he sometimes did after an especially difficult lesson, and Naruto held still under the gesture and let it mean what it meant. Then Iruka dropped his hand, squared his shoulders, turned toward the village. Come on, he said. I believe I owe you ramen. You absolutely owe me ramen, Naruto confirmed, and fell into step beside him, and for a little while they walked in comfortable silence through the last of the forest, and into the amber light of the village that was Naruto's home. The village he was going to protect someday with everything he had and everything he'd been given. The village that didn't yet know what it was walking toward in the form of one 12-year-old boy with dirt on his knees and the memory of 17 scrolled sections pressed into the back of his mind like a map to a place he'd never been but somehow already knew. Much later, after the ramen, after the warmth of Ichiraku's and Tuchi's cheerful chatter and Iam's kind eyes, after Irika had walked him to the door of his apartment building and said goodnight with a gravity that promised a longer conversation was coming soon, after all of that, Naruto stood alone on his apartment's small balcony in the quiet hour before dawn and looked out at the village. The rooftops were dark and still. The Hokage monument was a line of carved faces against the lightning sky, 5 great stone profiles looking out over the place they had led and protected and, in at least one case, died for. Naruto looked at them the way he had looked at them every night for as long as he could remember, with the loud, performed certainty that he would be up there someday, that his face would be the next one carved into that cliff, and the certainty was still there, still solid, still his. But it was quieter now. Less performance. More fact. He looked at the 4th Hokage's face for a long time. The note in the scroll had not named anyone. It had said your father and stopped there, trusting the reader to either know already or find out later. Naruto did not know yet, not for certain, not with evidence, not with the kind of knowing you could say out loud to another person. He had a feeling. He had a letter written in careful handwriting by someone who understood his chakra and his inheritance, and had left him a map inside a forbidden scroll. He had a feeling, and tonight, that was enough to carry. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the particular pale gray that came before the pink, the gray that said morning is coming whether you slept or not. Somewhere in the village, that early baker was already stoking his ovens. Somewhere, an Umbu patrol was completing its circuit and handing off to the dawn watch. The village was waking up, slowly and steadily, the way it always did. Naruto turned away from the monument. He went inside. He sat at his small table in his small apartment, and he spread his hands flat on the surface and looked at them. The calluses from academy training, the ink stains from tonight's reading, the faint traces of chakra still visible in the lines of his palms if you knew what you were looking for. And he thought about everything he had learned tonight, everything he now carried. He thought about Mizuki's face saying container. He thought about the letter saying not a curse. He thought about Irika stepping in front of a thrown shuriken without hesitating, and he thought about the way those 100 shadow clones had felt, right, natural, like his body had been waiting for him to finally do what it was designed to do. He thought about the warmth in his chest that was not entirely his own. He thought about the word Kurama, which appeared in some of the older Fuinjutsu notations in the scroll, a name associated with the fox spirit character in the containment diagram, a name he had not heard before but which settled into his mind like something he'd always been about to remember. He would not call it out yet. He was not ready, and he suspected it was not ready for him. But he would keep the name. He would keep all of it. Tomorrow, today technically since the sun was now edging its first gray light over the rooftops, he would go to the academy. He would take the graduation exam. He would perform well enough to pass without performing well enough to raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. He would receive his headband from Irika-sensei's hands, and he would tie it around his forehead, and he would begin the next chapter of his life as a ninja of Konoha. And in the weeks after that, in the quiet training grounds after dark and the hidden hours before dawn, he would keep working. He would build the theoretical understanding from tonight into real technique, real mastery, real ability. He would be patient in a way that did not come naturally to him, and was going to require daily effort. He would be strategic in a way that was entirely new. He would become, not immediately, not easily, not without cost, exactly what the scroll had seemed to suggest he could be, the inheritor of the Uzumaki bloodline. He was Naruto Uzumaki, and tonight something had changed, quietly and completely, in the deep interior of who he was and what he was capable of, and the world did not know it yet. That was fine. He was in no hurry. He could wait. He stood up from the table. He walked to his bed. He lay down without changing his clothes, facing the window, watching the sky go from gray to pale gold to the first real blue of morning. And somewhere in the watching he drifted into sleep, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has done exactly what they set out to do and is not yet afraid of what comes next. Outside, Konoha woke up. The day of Naruto Uzumaki's graduation had arrived. The headband was heavier than he'd expected. Not physically. It was a thin plate of metal on a strip of dark cloth, light enough that a child could carry it without noticing the weight. But Naruto had spent 12 years watching other people receive theirs, watching the way their faces changed when the metal settled against their foreheads, and he had always imagined the moment with a particular loudness, himself shouting at the top of his lungs, pumping his fist, knocking something over in his excitement, broadcasting the achievement to the entire village at maximum volume because that was how Naruto Uzumaki received good news. He had not shouted. He had sat in the graduation examination room with his hands folded on the desk while the proctor reviewed his paper, and he had performed the clone jutsu with 2 functional copies, not his best work by any measure, but sufficient, and more importantly, believable, which was a calculation he would not have known to make yesterday morning, and he had accepted the headband from Irika-sensei's hands with a single deep breath, and a smile that was real but quiet, the kind of smile that lived behind the eyes rather than in front of them. Irika had looked at him for a moment longer than the headband ceremony required. Then he had moved to the next student. Now Naruto sat on the roof of the academy building while the courtyard below filled with graduating students and their families. Parents lifting small siblings onto their shoulders for a better view, proud aunts producing cameras, old grandmothers weeping loudly into handkerchiefs, and he turned the headband over in his hands and thought about what it meant. Not what it was supposed to mean, what it actually meant. Now, for him, today, given everything that had changed in the single night between the person who had gone to steal a scroll and the person who had come back from stealing it, it meant he was starting. That was all. That was enough. He tied it around his forehead, adjusted the metal plate until it sat level, and looked out over the rooftops of the village without saying anything to anyone. Below him, somewhere in the crowd, a mother was calling her child's name with a pride so unguarded it carried all the way up to the roof and sat beside him like something borrowed. Naruto didn't move for a long time. The team assignments came 3 days later. He had spent those 3 days in a state of disciplined patience that cost him more effort than any physical training he had ever done. The urge to go back to the training grounds, to work on what he'd started, to convert theory into practice while the scroll's contents were still fresh and organized in his mind. That urge was constant and insistent, a pressure behind his sternum that he managed by walking the village at odd hours and eating large quantities of beef ramen, and doing basic chakra exercises on his apartment floor at 2 in the morning when the pressure became too specific to ignore through walking alone. He was also, on a different and more complicated level, processing the letter H, the careful handwriting. Your father. The note in the Shikifujin section had been written by someone who had access to a scroll that lived in the Hokage's personal vault, which meant the H was either a Hokage or someone with a Hokage's confidence. The inserted pages in the middle section had been added after the scroll's original compilation, suggesting the writer had returned to an already sealed document specifically to leave something for someone they expected to find it eventually. The inheritor of the Uzumaki bloodline, Naruto had no family. He had known this since he was old enough to ask the question and receive the careful, non-committal answers that adults gave when they had been instructed not to tell a child something. He had no parents, no relatives, no clan name attached to his headband. He was Uzumaki Naruto, and the Uzumaki part had always been a lone word with nothing behind it, except that the scroll's Fuinjutsu section had recognized him. Except that the letter had said your mother's blood. Except that somewhere in the history of a village that had sealed away its most important secrets in a scroll that only the Hokage could access, someone with the initial H had written pages specifically meant for the child who would someday find them. He thought about this carefully and constantly, and refused to let himself reach the obvious conclusion until he had more than a feeling to support it. Feelings were not evidence. Evidence was evidence. He would find the evidence when the time was right. He would be patient. He was very bad at being patient, but he was learning. Team 7. The classroom assignment board listed it with the same bureaucratic plainness as all the others, 3 names in a row, a team number, a Jonin instructor's name. Naruto read it twice. Then he sat back in his seat and considered the particular configuration fate had apparently decided to hand him. Uzumaki Naruto. Uchiha Sasuke. Hareno Sakura. He had opinions about this arrangement, none of which he expressed. Sasuke Uchiha sat 2 rows ahead and 1 seat to the left, in the posture he always occupied, back straight, arms folded, expression calibrated to project an absolute minimum of interest in his surroundings. It was a very practiced posture. Naruto had been watching it for years from a complicated mixture of rivalry and something less comfortable than rivalry, The particular feeling of looking at someone whose acknowledgement you had wanted and never received. He still felt the rivalry. The other thing was quieter now, less urgent. He was not sure what that meant. Haruno Sakura sat at the desk beside Naruto's with her chin propped on her hand and an expression of luminous happiness directed at the back of Sasuke's head. Naruto had also been watching this for years, from a complicated mixture of affection and the kind of resigned understanding that came with knowing exactly where you ranked in someone's estimation. He was fine. He was genuinely fine. He had, in the course of one night, reorganized his priorities so significantly that the particular ache of Sakura's indifference was now approximately the 15th most important thing on his internal list, which was a different place from where it had lived before. Team 7, Sakura said, in the tone of someone receiving exactly the gift they'd hoped for. We're on the same team, Sasuke-kun. Sasuke said nothing. This was, for Sasuke, a form of acknowledgement. Naruto looked at the window. Kakashi Hatake arrived late. Not slightly late. Not the kind of late that could be attributed to traffic or a misfiled schedule. He arrived with a quality of lateness that suggested the concept of punctuality was something he was aware of in the abstract but had not personally chosen to participate in. Arriving into the classroom with an unhurried step and an expression that communicated, through the medium of the single visible eye above his mask, that he found the situation entirely satisfactory regardless of how long he had kept 3 12-year-olds waiting in a room with nothing to do. Naruto had heard of Kakashi Hatake. Everyone who paid attention to village gossip had heard of Kakashi Hatake, the copy ninja, the man who had supposedly memorized over 1,000 jutsu, the jonin who had failed more genin teams than he had passed because his standards were, by general consensus, unreasonable. He was also, by several accounts Naruto had collected over years of careful listening, one of the most genuinely powerful shinobi in the village. Naruto looked at him with interest. Kakashi looked at all three of them with the visible eye and said, "Meet me on the roof." The rooftop introduction exercise was brief and somewhat one-sided. Kakashi asked them to share their names, their likes, their dislikes, and their dreams, with the air of someone going through a procedure they found moderately entertaining. Sakura went first. Likes, Sasuke, various foods, being useful. Dislikes, Naruto, dreams, unspecified but clearly Sasuke adjacent. Sasuke went second. Likes, nothing stated. Dislikes, a great many things stated with quiet intensity. Dreams, framed as an ambition involving restoration and a certain someone who needed to be found. Then Kakashi looked at Naruto. Naruto had been thinking about this moment since the assignment board. He had prepared 2 versions of what to say, the version he would have given yesterday, which was loud and specific and involved the word Hokage approximately 4 times in 30 seconds, and the version he was considering giving today. Naruto Uzumaki, he said. I like beef ramen, training, and people who mean what they say. I dislike waiting around and people who use other people. He paused. My dream is to become Hokage. He said it without the usual volume. Flat, simple, a statement of fact rather than a declaration. I want to become someone the village can rely on. That's all. Silence from Team 7. Sakura was looking at him with a slight frown, the expression of someone who had received information that didn't match the file they'd been keeping. Sasuke had turned his head a fraction, not toward Naruto, not overtly, but the angle of his chin had changed in a way that suggested a recalibration was occurring somewhere behind the deliberately blank expression. Kakashi's visible eye moved over Naruto's face with a patience that was clearly assessment rather than idleness. Whatever he found there, he filed it without expression. Interesting, he said, which could have meant anything. He went on to explain the bell test, and the team went home to sleep without dinner, and Naruto lay awake on his apartment floor doing chakra suppression exercises until 3 in the morning. The training ground was beautiful in the early morning. Naruto arrived first. He had left his apartment before the sun cleared the tree line, walking the empty streets with his hands in his pockets and his headband fitted properly for the first time over his forehead. Ground 7 was a standard outdoor training area, 3 training posts at the center, a small river to the east, heavy forest to the north and west providing cover and natural obstacles, the kind of terrain that rewarded awareness. He walked the perimeter twice before Sakura arrived, then Sasuke, then, considerably later, with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided that arrival time was a variable rather than a constant, Kakashi. The bell test was explained simply. 2 bells, 3 genin. The one left without a bell at noon would be sent back to the academy. The underlying test, the real one, the one about teamwork and communication and the choice to work together rather than compete, was visible to Naruto the moment Kakashi stopped speaking. It was not subtle, if you were looking for it. 2 bells, 3 students. The math announced the lesson. But Naruto had made a decision about today before today had started. Today was not the day to demonstrate what he could do. This was harder than it sounded. The techniques were there, present in his mind with the clarity of things deeply memorized, waiting to be used, pulling at his hands the way a fully drawn bow pulled at the fingers holding the string. The wind nature instinct he'd felt in the scroll was stronger in an outdoor environment. He could feel the air moving around him with a specificity that hadn't existed before. A subtle awareness of currents and pressures and the way leaves moved differently in the wake of a fast-moving body. The Fuinjutsu knowledge sat in his mind like a toolkit he kept reaching for by reflex. He did not reach for any of it. When Kakashi moved, impossibly fast, jonin fast, the speed that made Academy Taijutsu look like movement in water, Naruto let himself be caught. Not completely, not stupidly, but enough. He blocked 2 strikes and took the third, rolled with it, came up in a defensive stance that was better than dead last Academy performance, but not better than believable impressive for a new genin. He used shadow clones, his one freely available technique, already demonstrated at the graduation exam, already in his known repertoire, to create pressure from multiple angles while Sakura circled and Sasuke moved in from the opposite side. The clones were good. They were, if he was honest, very good, better coordinated than they should have been for a genin who had theoretically learned the technique 3 days ago, moving with a tactical awareness that came from weeks of shadow clone study rather than 3 days of practice. He moderated this as best he could, introducing small timing errors, having clones overcommit in ways that read as inexperience. Kakashi retrieved both bells without significant difficulty. But he paused, once, mid-engagement, for just a fraction of a second, and looked at Naruto with his single visible eye in a way that suggested something had briefly not added up. Naruto kept his expression at exactly the right level of frustrated effort, and said nothing. Noon arrived. None of them had a bell. They sat at the memorial post to which Kakashi had tied them, Naruto and Sakura, at least. Sasuke had not been caught, which was expected. He had simply failed to retrieve a bell, which was also somewhat expected given that the test was not designed to be solved through individual excellence, and Kakashi stood before them with both bells still in his hand, looking at them with the expression of a man who has watched this scene many times and finds it consistently instructive. "You're all failures," Kakashi said pleasantly. The objective was to retrieve the bells. None of you retrieved the bells. Technically, all 3 of you should be sent back to the academy. Sakura's face fell. Sasuke's expression did not change, which for Sasuke was itself a form of reaction. Naruto said, "You only said 2 of us would fail." Kakashi looked at him. "Excuse me? When you explained the test, you said the one left without a bell would be sent back. That implied at least 2 of us would get bells." Naruto's tone was even, not argumentative. Observational. "But you had 2 bells and there are 3 of us, which means mathematically someone was always going to be without a bell regardless of performance. So the test wasn't actually about getting the bells." A pause. Kakashi's eye curved slightly, which was what it did when he was smiling. "Go on." "It was about what we did when we realized we couldn't all succeed individually. Whether we'd compete against each other or find a way to work the problem differently." Naruto glanced at Sasuke briefly, then back at Kakashi. "We didn't. We all went at it separately. That was the actual failure." The silence that followed was the specific silence of 2 12-year-olds processing that they had been looking at the wrong problem. Kakashi studied Naruto for a long moment, a careful study, attentive and unhurried, the way a very experienced person studied something that had presented unexpectedly. Then he looked at all 3 of them and said, "In the world of shinobi, those who break the rules are trash. But those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash." He let them eat. Naruto ate his rice balls quietly while Sasuke sat at the base of the memorial post and ate with the focused silence of someone who was not thinking about food at all. and Sakura periodically looked between her two teammates with an expression that had been steadily revised throughout the afternoon from its starting point of barely concealed dismissal of Naruto toward something more evaluative and unsettled. Naruto noticed all of this. He filed it. He also noticed Kakashi watching him from across the clearing with a cup of green tea, the book he usually held nowhere in evidence, his full attention directed at the new team he had just been given in a way that suggested the book was normally a cover for exactly this kind of observation. Naruto met his eye briefly, the single visible one, and then looked back at his rice balls. Later, when Kakashi announced that Team 7 had passed and they were receiving their official assignments the following week, Naruto said nothing that was not completely normal for a new genin. He was enthusiastic at an appropriate volume. He celebrated at an appropriate scale. He walked home alone in the blue evening and reviewed everything he had managed to conceal. Sufficient. More than sufficient. He was learning. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that Naruto built carefully and maintained with a discipline that no one who knew him from the academy would have recognized as his. Days were for Team 7 missions, training, the gradual construction of a unit from 3 individuals who shared a headband designation and nothing else. The missions were largely mundane, delivering packages, weeding vegetable gardens for elderly villagers, helping a cartwright move his entire workshop 2 blocks east for reasons the cartwright could not fully articulate. Naruto performed these missions with competent cheerfulness, complained at an appropriate frequency about the lack of excitement, and was, on the surface, entirely consistent with the person everyone had always thought he was. Evenings were for the scroll, not the scroll itself. Iruka had returned it to the vault, and Naruto's access to it had been a single night's anomaly. But the scroll's contents lived in his mind with the completeness of things learned through shadow clone multiplication, and in the evenings he took those contents out of storage and began the slow, physical work of converting memorized theory into practiced reality. He had found a location. There was a section of forest on the eastern edge of the training grounds that lay in a natural depression, lower than the surrounding terrain, shielded on 3 sides by a steep rise in the ground and on the 4th by a dense stand of trees whose canopy was old enough to be opaque. Sound did not carry easily out of it. Chakra signatures, in his experience, were harder to detect from above than from the same level, which meant that the depression's position reduced his visibility to any sensors positioned at normal height. He had also, in the 3rd week, begun practicing the chakra suppression technique from the scroll's 5th section. This had been the right decision in a way that only became clear once he started trying to do it. The technique, as the scroll had suggested, was structured around finding the surface of one's chakra output rather than controlling the output itself, a matter of locating the outermost layer of the energy field he naturally projected and learning to draw it inward, to collapse it deliberately, to pull the projection tight against his body like a coat drawn closed against cold wind. It was the difference between dimming a light and moving a lamp into a closet. The light was still there, still burning at full strength, but the illumination it cast was contained. The first 10 attempts had produced nothing. The next 20 had produced a faint, inconsistent reduction in his output, measurable only because he had rigged a test for himself using the only sensor technique he had access to, which was a modified version of a basic academy chakra sensing exercise that he had spent 3 evenings converting from a general awareness pulse into something specific enough to give him feedback. The 31st attempt had worked. Not perfectly, not the clean, total suppression the scroll described as possible with sufficient practice, but a genuine, sustained reduction that he held for 7 seconds before his concentration fractured and his chakra expanded back to its natural projection like a breath released after too long held. 7 seconds. A start. By the end of the 3rd week, he could hold it for 4 minutes. The shadow clone training was more immediately productive, because the shadow clone technique was already his, was already mastered, and using it to study was simply a matter of scale and organization. Each evening, Naruto would create between 20 and 50 clones depending on what he was working on and how much chakra he wanted to spend, and he would distribute them across the depression, some working on chakra control exercises, some practicing hand seal sequences from the scroll, some simply sitting with specific sections of the memorized text and turning them over in their minds the way you turn stones to find what lived underneath. When the clones dispersed, their learning returned to him in the compressed rush he'd experienced on the first night, and he would spend an hour integrating what they had found before sleeping. It was, he had come to understand, the most efficient learning system he would ever have access to. The chakra cost was real. He ran low, sometimes, in ways that made him slower and less sharp in the afternoons. But Kurama's presence in him, the warmth he could feel at the edge of conscious awareness, seemed to be quietly compensating. He would wake in the mornings with his reserves restored to a degree that straight sleep should not have accounted for. He did not mention this to anyone. The Kuchio section was progressing. He could now summon consistently. The frogs were larger than the first fist-sized one, real enough to blink at him with genuine amphibian suspicion before he dismissed them, real enough that he could see the detail in their skin and hear the sound of their arrival. The largest one yet had been about knee-height, stocky and thoroughly unimpressed with its situation, and had said, in a voice that was surprisingly deep for its size, "Again? You again?" before vanishing with a pop that suggested it was exercising its right to be elsewhere. He had felt an enormous, private, overwhelming rush of delight about this that he had expressed to no one. The wind-nature awareness continued to develop without deliberate cultivation, growing on its own schedule the way some things grew when you simply stopped interfering with them. He became, over the weeks, increasingly attuned to the movement of air in ways he struggled to describe even to himself. Not sight, not exactly sound. More like a background awareness of pressure differentials, a constant low-level knowledge of how the air was moving and where it was going and what was displacing it. He had read about wind-nature affinity in the scroll's elemental section and understood that this was the affinity making itself known, the element recognizing the person it belonged to. He had not yet attempted futon, shinkigyoku. The vacuum sphere technique was advanced enough that he wanted his chakra control at a higher level before he tried to compress air with sufficient density to produce the effect the scroll described. Getting it wrong would produce, best case, a strong breeze. Worst case, a chakra implosion in his hands that would be difficult to explain to Kakashi. Patience. He was learning patience. He was also, slowly and with considerable internal resistance, making progress on Shozen Jutsu. The medical ninjutsu problem came down to precision. The healing technique required chakra to be emitted in a concentrated, stable flow at a low enough intensity that it could interact with biological tissue without disrupting it, which meant everything about how Naruto naturally used chakra needed to be reversed. His natural output was high intensity and high volume. He needed it to be low intensity and fine-grained. The gap between where he was and where the technique required him to be was substantial, but he was closing it. His clones had developed, in the course of the third week, an exercise for this. One clone would hold a leaf to its palm with chakra while simultaneously reducing the chakra output to the minimum amount that would still hold the leaf in place. The exercise was standard Academy chakra control training, but the shadow clone application multiplied its effectiveness. 50 clones practicing the same micro-control exercise simultaneously, their adjustments feeding back to him when they dispersed, let him iterate through the problem at a pace that individual practice could not have matched. By the end of week 4, the green glow of Shozen Jutsu stayed stable in his palm for 30 seconds before it destabilized. He did not tell anyone about any of this. Sasuke noticed on a Tuesday. It was the kind of noticing that happened sideways. Not a confrontation, not a direct question, but a series of small observations accumulating in someone too perceptive to leave them unintegrated. Naruto had been watching for it, and was still slightly caught off guard by the specific form it took. They were on a team training day, a free sparring session that Kakashi had set up in the eastern section of Ground 7. The session was Sasuke versus Naruto, standard taijutsu with jutsu allowed, while Kakashi watched from a nearby log with his book open at what Naruto had come to suspect was always the same page. The fight was going the way fights between Naruto and Sasuke had always gone at the academy. Sasuke moving with the elegant precision of someone who had been training since he could walk. Naruto going in loud and direct and getting tagged repeatedly before finding openings through sheer persistence. The difference was that today, Naruto was being hit less than he had been at the academy. Not dramatically less. Not in a way that should have been obvious. He was blocking a fraction earlier than he used to, reading Sasuke's weight shifts and adjusting his positioning in ways that were subtle enough to look like improving reflexes rather than pattern recognition. He was getting hit. He just wasn't getting hit as often, and the strikes he did absorb were landing on the parts of him that could absorb them rather than the parts that couldn't. Sasuke noticed on the third exchange. Naruto saw it happen, the slight pause in Sasuke's follow-through, the recalibration in his eyes. The moment where the expected opening Sasuke was moving to exploit did not appear where he expected it because Naruto had shifted 6 inches to the left 2 counts before Sasuke reached for it. The pause was brief. Sasuke adjusted and kept going, but he was paying attention differently after that. Near the end of the session, Naruto created 3 shadow clones as a distraction and moved around Sasuke's left side, a maneuver that should not have worked because Sasuke knew to watch for the real body behind the clones. It didn't work. Sasuke tagged the real Naruto without difficulty, because Sasuke was very good at what he did and because Naruto was not trying to actually beat him today, just to perform at a level that was convincingly improving. What Sasuke did next was unexpected, he said quietly, not to Naruto exactly, more to the air between them. Your clones move with tactical spacing. Naruto dismissed the remaining clones. What? When you use shadow clones, they position themselves to cover angles. Sasuke's voice was flat, analytical. That's not what they taught us at the academy. They taught us to use clones as visual diversions. What you're doing is geometric. You're filling lanes. A silence. Naruto looked at Sasuke with the expression he had been practicing in his apartment mirror, the expression of a person who has been mildly surprised rather than the expression of a person who has been caught doing something specific. I've been working on it, he said. Clones are what I've got, so I figured I should get better at them. Sasuke looked at him for a moment. That's not something you figure out in a few weeks. Sure it is, if you practice enough. Naruto shrugged, and the shrug was exactly right, casual, slightly defensive, the texture of someone deflecting a compliment they didn't know how to receive. You know me. I don't have a whole lot of techniques to work with, so... Another silence. Sasuke's expression didn't change, but something behind it had completed a calculation and was holding the result without displaying it. You're still too slow in your initial response, Sasuke said finally, which was Sasuke's version of dropping the subject. Your first movement off the mark is half a beat late. Fix it. Thanks, Naruto said. Very helpful. Sasuke turned away. On the log, Kakashi turned the same page he had been on for 40 minutes, and said nothing, and the single visible eye was not looking at the book. It was Sakura who asked the direct question. This surprised Naruto slightly, because Sakura's attention during these weeks had been primarily oriented towards Sasuke and toward her own training, which she was pursuing with a focused intensity that Naruto found genuinely admirable. She was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of academic intelligence that the Academy's written examinations measured reasonably well, and she had begun, in recent weeks, applying that intelligence to the practical problems of being a field shinobi in ways that went beyond the standard curriculum. The question came on a Thursday afternoon, after a mission, a simple escort job that had been routine in every respect. They were walking back through the village, still in formation out of habit, and Sakura had fallen into step beside Naruto in a way that felt deliberate. Naruto, she said. Yeah? During the escort. When those 2 missing men appeared from the left alley. She paused. You moved before Kakashi-sensei gave the order. Naruto thought about this. They telegraphed it. You could see it from the shadow on the wall. I couldn't see it from the shadow on the wall. He paused, picking his words. I've been working on awareness. Reading the environment. It's not that complicated. Sakura was quiet for several steps. She had the particular quality of quiet that smart people had when they were deciding how much of their conclusion to share out loud. You've been different, she said finally. Since the graduation? Not loudly different. Quietly different. Naruto said nothing. I'm not saying it's bad, Sakura added quickly, with the care of someone correcting a potential misunderstanding. It's not bad. It's just, you're different, and I notice things, and I've been noticing you're different, and I don't know what to do with that information exactly. Naruto looked at her sideways. 12 years old, pink hair, green eyes currently focused on the middle distance with the expression of someone being honest with themselves in real time, which took a particular kind of courage, and which he had not fully given her credit for having. He thought about the Sakura who had called him names in the academy. He thought about the Sakura who had looked at him across the team assignment board with barely concealed disappointment. He thought about the Sakura who had, without comment, helped him bandage his arm after a training exercise last week and done it correctly, done it well. People were more than one thing. He knew this better than most. I've just been working harder, he said. That's all. Nothing dramatic. Sakura looked at him with the green eyes that were currently performing a very precise assessment. You knew the answer on the bell test. Before any of us. I thought about it quickly. You were tied to a post. I think well when I'm tied to things. New development. He gave her the grin, the real one, wide and slightly ridiculous, the one that had always been his best deflection because it was genuine, and it invited people to laugh with him rather than press further. Don't make it into a thing, Sakura. I'm just trying to be better. She looked at him for another moment. Then something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, something more considering, and she looked away. Okay, she said. They walked the rest of the way back in silence that was not uncomfortable. Kakashi did not ask. Kakashi watched. Naruto became aware of this gradually, aware that the book was not always being read, that the deliberate casualness with which Kakashi occupied training sessions was a performance as calculated as anything Naruto himself was doing. The Jonin single visible eye had a quality of comprehensive observation that it would have been easy to miss if you were not paying attention to eyes, which Naruto had learned to do in 12 years of being watched for the wrong reasons and was now doing from a different motivation. Kakashi watched the geometric precision of his clone formations. Kakashi watched him read environments before acting in them. Kakashi watched, twice, his shadow clone disperse and saw the way Naruto blinked and stilled for a quarter second as the clone's experience returned to him, something that looked like nothing to an untrained observer but that a man with Kakashi's experience would recognize as the signature of the multi-clone return technique. Kakashi said nothing. He said it with a particular quality of deliberate silence that communicated to anyone paying attention that the silence was a choice. He was not missing what he was seeing, he was deciding to wait, which was different. Naruto, watching Kakashi's not watching, made a decision of his own. He would not be careless. He would not perform more than was necessary or let his guard down in training more than the situation required. But he would also not pretend that Kakashi was not one of the more perceptive people he was ever likely to encounter, and pretending too hard in the presence of genuine perception had a way of producing the opposite of the intended effect. He would be careful. He would not be afraid. There was a difference, and it mattered. In the 5th week, Naruto reached a threshold in the chakra suppression technique. He was in the depression, mid-evening, the sky a deep amber above the tree canopy, 20 clones working in organized silence around the perimeter, when the suppression technique settled into place with a clean, complete finality that was unlike every previous attempt, not the gradual, inconsistent reduction he'd been achieving. This was the technique as described in the scroll, a total collapse of his external chakra signature to a fraction of its natural size. He held it for 10 seconds. 20. A minute. 2 minutes. He walked the perimeter of the depression while holding it. He ran. He practiced hand seals. He maintained the suppression through physical activity, through the distraction of motion, through the mild chakra expenditure of sustaining basic awareness. The technique held. When he finally released it, deliberately, cleanly, his chakra bloomed back outward like light through an open curtain, and the warmth he associated with Kurama pressed upward briefly from the deep interior of his awareness, a sensation that had no emotional content attached to it but that Naruto had come to interpret as something close to acknowledgement. The fox noticed things. It noticed this. Yeah, Naruto said quietly, to the air of the depression, to no one visible. The warmth retreated to its usual background level. He dismissed his clones. He sat in the grass with his back against the earthen slope of the depression wall, and turned his face up to the amber sky and felt, for a moment, the full shape of what he was becoming, not what he had been, not what everyone expected, but the actual emerging shape of it. The person who was building himself in secret in this hollow in the earth while the village moved around him unaware. It was strange. It was lonely sometimes, in a way that was different from the old loneliness. The old loneliness was about rejection, about absence, about the village looking through him. This new loneliness was the loneliness of a secret, the specific isolation of carrying something important that you couldn't share yet, that wasn't ready yet to be seen. He thought about telling Irika. Not everything. Irika knew about the shadow clone training already. had chosen to fold that knowledge into the report he'd filed about the night of the scroll theft in ways that were technically accurate and practically ambiguous. But the Fuinjutsu, the summoning progress, the suppression technique, the letter with the initial H. He thought about sitting in Ichiraku Ramen with Iruka-sensei across from him, and saying I think I know who my father was, and watching Iruka's face and seeing what was there. Not yet. He would know when it was time. He would be patient. He stood up. He dusted grass from his pants. He walked home through the evening village with his chakra held quiet and close, invisible as still water and dark ground, and he bought a cup of hot green tea from the stall near the river and drank it on the bridge while the water moved below him and the lights of Konoha came on one by one in the settling dark. He was becoming something. He wasn't fully sure what yet. But the shape of it was clarifying, day by day, training session by training session, the way shapes clarified in water as it settled after being disturbed. He finished the tea. He walked home. Tomorrow was a Team 7 mission day. He would carry packages or pull weeds or help some confused civilian with something that did not require any of what he was building, and he would do it well and without complaint, and without showing anything that wasn't ready to be shown yet. And in the evening, he would come back to the depression and do the work. That was enough. That was exactly enough. He turned out the light in his apartment and lay in the dark, and from somewhere deep and resonant in the architecture of who he was, something old and enormous and not quite hostile breathed in the slow, powerful way that fire breathed, and Naruto felt it, and was not afraid. He closed his eyes. The village of Konoha breathed around him in the dark. The bakers and the sentries and the mothers with their feverish children, the umbu on the rooftops, the old women who sat up late because sleeping alone was harder than it had been once. The village that did not know what was being built quietly within it, in the form of a 12-year-old boy who had picked up a scroll one night and read it cover to cover and chosen, in the silence afterward, to be different from what anyone expected, different, and patient, and entirely, quietly certain of where he was going. He slept.